Chapter 23, The Shadow of Victory. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tony Green. The Shadow of Victory by Myrtle Reed. Chapter 23. After the first part of the battle was over, the bateau in which Mrs. Mackenzie and the children sat was brought near the shore at the mouth of the river. When Mrs. Franklin was taken from her horse, an Indian carried her to the boat, laid her in the bottom of it, signed to her to keep quiet, and covered her with a blanket. She was badly wounded, and her position was well nigh intolerable, but she was afraid to move. Two warriors soon approached and demanded the prisoners, which they said were concealed under the luggage. But the Indian at the oars assured them that the bateau contained only the family of Shauna Orkey, and they went away apparently satisfied. Catherine had fainted when she found herself in the arms of a painted savage. When she came to her senses, she was in the deep water, and the Indian still held her in a firm grasp. She struggled until her strength was almost gone, but then perceived that her captor did not intend to drown her. Long and earnestly she looked into his face, and at length, in spite of the hideous disguise of his war-paint, she recognized Black Partridge. Another brave joined him, and after a long conversation between them, she was left to the care of the second Indian. Black Partridge went back to the battlefield, received Captain Franklin's surrender through an interpreter, and then returned to Mrs. Howard. When the firing had ceased, she was lifted out of the water and carried to the shore. Black Partridge took her by the arm and led her northward along the beach. She was drenched through, and her clothes were heavy with water. A squaw had stolen her shoes, and the long march upon the burning sand was exceedingly painful. But when they came near the fort and she saw her mother upon the piazza at the trading station, she went on with new courage. In the dismantled home the survivors were gathered. Captain and Mrs. Franklin both wounded, Lieutenant Howard also wounded. The Mackenzies, their children, and a few of the soldiers were all that remained of the company that had fared forth so gallantly only a few hours before. When Catherine staggered in, her husband caught her in his arms, and his hot tears fell upon her face when he stooped to kiss her. "I thought you were dead," he cried. "I never knew till now how much I love you." A radiant smile illuminated her white face. "I thought you were dead too," she whispered, "and I didn't care to live. I wanted to be with you, wherever you might be." One after another described what he had seen, and the melancholy details of the battle were soon told. It was stipulated in the terms of the surrender that the lives of the prisoners should be spared, but the Indians considered the wounded exempt from that provision, and horrible things were done upon the field. Captain Norton's heroic efforts to save Catherine, the valiant death of Captain Wells, Mad Margaret's fearless dash against the enemy, the half-breed's gallant fight, and the courage of the soldier's wife, who let herself be literally hacked to pieces rather than be taken prisoner. These things and many others were sadly recounted. Captain Franklin assured them that Ensign Ronald was dead, and they were glad to believe him. But no one knew what had become of Robert and Beatrice. "Forsyth fought beside me for a while," said the captain. "And with me also," added the lieutenant, "on another part of the field." "Where is my Cousin Bee?" asked Maria Indiana plaintively. "I want my Cousin Bee." At this they all broke down, and even the men were not ashamed of their tears. Beatrice, the merry-hearted, whose bird-like laughter still seemed to linger in the desolate home. Where was she? "Oh God," sobbed Mrs. Mackenzie, "if only we knew that she was dead." "We'll hope she is," said the trader brokenly. "She must be, or she'd be here." He tried to speak as if he were sure, but his face belied his words. Outside, groups of Indians moved about restlessly. From sheer savage wantonness they'd killed the cattle that were left to them as the troops turned away from the fort. The houses had all been plundered, and incongruous articles were strewn all over the plain. The finery of the women had been divided, and the savage who had Captain Wells' scalp at his belt wore Catherine's bonnet upon his head. Mackenzie, with his penknife, had removed 2 bullets from Mrs. Franklin's arm, and had improvised a bandage from some old linen he found in the house. Catherine was badly wounded in the shoulder, where the tomahawk meant for her had struck when Black Partridge snatched her away. Lieutenant Howard had several cuts upon his body, and Captain Franklin and Mackenzie were each wounded in the thigh. As some of them had suspected from the first, they were British prisoners, and were to be taken to Fort Mackinac or Detroit very soon. "Tomorrow," answered the Indian chief, whom Mackenzie asked, "or perhaps the next day. No stay here long." Black Partridge had vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed him up. The Mackenzies looked for him anxiously among the Indians who patrolled the fort and the river bank. In spite of the surrender, his presence was the only assurance of safety they had. An animated discussion was going on in front of the house, for a party of Indians, evidently from the Wabash, had just arrived. There was much loud talking and many gestures, and the bleeding scalps were fingered with admiring curiosity. Mrs. Mackenzie sat near the window, sheltered by a curtain, hoping and yet fearing to see Beatrice's beautiful hair ornamenting the belt of some savage. The mutterings outside grew louder, and hostile glances were turned upon the trading station. "Mackenzie," said the captain, "have we any means of defence?" "Not even a musket," answered the trader bitterly, "and that door wouldn't hold more than 2 minutes." Even as he spoke, a company of Indians came up the path. "Quick, Catherine," commanded Mrs. Mackenzie. "Here." She pushed her onto the bed in the next room and covered her with the feather bed, fearing that her light hair and fair skin would betray her as a newcomer to the more remote Indians. With supreme self-command, Mrs. Mackenzie sat on the bed beside her and sorted out a bag of patchwork pieces, humming as she did so, in a voice she scarcely knew. The intruders entered and went through the house, peering into every nook and corner. When they were in the next room, Catherine whispered to her mother, "Oh, let me go. This is unbearable, and I can die but once. Let them have me." "Hush," said Mrs. Mackenzie, to a faltering tune. "Don't move, and they will go away. If you stir, it means the death of us all." She went on with her work, scattering the gay pieces all over the bed and the floor, but the Indians did not go. They grouped themselves about the doors and windows, effectually cutting off escape. Every one of them was heavily armed, and their faces were sullen and revengeful. They began to mutter to each other and exchange significant glances. All hope was lost, when the door was pushed open and Black Partridge came into the room. "How now, my friends," he said. "A good day to you. I was told that there were enemies here, but I'm glad to find only friends. Why have you blackened your faces? Is it that you're mourning for the friends you have lost in battle, or is it that you are fasting? If so, ask our friend here, and he will give you to eat. He is the Indians' friend, and never yet refused them what they had need of." Thus shamed, the spokesman of the party explained that they had come for some white cotton cloth in which to wrap their dead. This was given to them, and they went away peaceably. Then Mackenzie had a long talk with the chief and told him of their anxiety for Robert and Beatrice. The others, guessing at the subject, pressed close around them. "What does he say?" asked Catherine, anxiously. But the trader made no answer until the Indian had gone. "He says he will put a strong guard of his own people all around the house, and that we will be safe here. But we must strike no lights and make no noise, because some of the Indians from the far country do not know that we are their friends. He says the big soldier is dead from a tomahawk that struck him in the breast, and that the little black horse is also dead on the plains far south of here. But neither the scalp of the paleface nor that of her lover are among those his braves have taken. He bids us to be quiet and wait for news." "To wait?" sighed Mrs. Mackenzie. "To wait for news? It is the hardest thing in the world. The heat of the afternoon was sickening, so the curtains were closely drawn, and the little company huddled together, scarcely daring to speak above a whisper, but gathering human comfort and new courage from the mere sight of each other, wounded though they were. Maria Indiana and the baby were put to bed for their regular afternoon nap, and some of the comforts of life were still left in the house. So the day passed on with a double line of Indians around the house, and the hum and whir of midsummer coming to their ears from the fields beyond them, as if there had been no massacre, and there was no such thing as death. Robert and Beatrice were in the shade of a sandhill, nearly 5 miles south of the fort. When his horse had rested a little, he assisted her to mount, and walked by her side until they reached the only shelter that was available. The sun was approaching the west, and the mound kept off the direct rays, as well as the southwest wind. They were faint from hunger, and both were slightly wounded, but otherwise they were quite comfortable. In front of them lay the lake, serene and smooth, with not a ripple upon its glassy surface, and no reflection of the conflict that had just been waged was mirrored upon its waters. Robert was one who recovered his strength quickly, and as the afternoon wore on he began to feel like himself. After reaching the sandhill, his first act had been to cut open the sleeve of the girl's dress and apply his lips to her wound. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you do that?" "Because the arrow may have been poisoned, dear." "Then you'll be poisoned too," she said, drawing away from him. "No, I won't." In spite of her protests, he drew the blood until no more came, then bathed the wound with water from the lake and bandaged it with a clean handkerchief he happened to have in his pocket. Afterward, lover-like, he kissed the fair, smooth arm from shoulder to wrist, with an exquisite sense of possession. "What are we going to do?" asked Beatrice after a little. "We can do nothing until night. Then I'll cover you with sand, all but your head, and go back to the wagons for food and ammunition. I'll get another horse too if I can find one, and then we'll go to Fort Wayne." "And if you can't find another horse?" "You'll ride this one and I'll lead him. I'll get you a saddle if I can." "We'll never make it," she said sadly. "Yes, we will. I'm sure of it. Life means too much to us, darling, to give it up without a fight." The deep crimson dyed her white face. I had to tell you," she whispered, "or you never would have known." A long shadow appeared upon the sand, and Robert saw the unmistakable outlines of a feather headdress. Beatrice was nestled in his arms with her face against his breast. His pistol was at his belt loaded, and his sword lay near him. "Is your pistol loaded, dear?" he asked very softly. She started away from him in terror. "Yes," she cried, "but why?" "Hush." He pointed to the shadow on the sand, which stealthily approached. "Oh," she moaned, "after all this." Robert rose to his feet and went noiselessly towards the southern side of the sandhill. Beatrice stood just behind him, white as death. Then Black Partridge appeared before them, with something very like a smile upon his face. "How?" he grunted cordially. The conversation which followed was a veritable confusion of tongues. Robert knew as much of the Indian language as the other did of English, but after some little time he was made to understand that they were British prisoners, and that, for the present, they were safe. "Ask him about Aunt Eleanor and the others," said Beatrice. There was another long colloquy. "They're all safe," Robert explained finally. "The white father and his wife, the other white father and his fair-skinned wife, and the family of Shawnee. They've been anxious about us, and when he goes back he'll tell them that we're all right." By signs and broken speech, Black Partridge made it evident that they could not stay where they were, and ordered them to follow him. Robert demurred, but the chief frowned upon him so fiercely that he dared not disobey. From a voluble speech in the Indian tongue, Robert gathered that Black Partridge had not forgotten his promise, that the memory of the picture was still warm in his heart, and that he was the faithful friend of the paleface and her lover. Beatrice smiled when Robert told her what he had said. "He knew, didn't he?" she asked shyly. They began their long march northward upon the sand. Beatrice was mounted, and Robert walked beside her, straight as an arrow and as tireless as an eagle. The Indian went swiftly in front of them, looking back now and then to see if they were still following. It was a hard journey for Beatrice, since the dead lay all around her. Even the Indians Robert had killed seemed to distress her, and when she passed the spot where Queen lay, she could not keep back her tears. Vultures with slow-beating wings were silhouetted now and then against the setting sun as they went from one gruesome feast to another. "What are those birds?" asked the girl. "I never saw them before." "I don't know," lied Robert. "I've never seen them either." The wind had covered Ronald's body with drifted sand, and she had spared the bitterness of that. But the plain of death with its burden of mangled bodies would have touched a harder heart than hers. "Don't look, darling," he pleaded, and obediently she turned her face away, but the tears fell fast none the less, and she could not repress her sobs. "Sweetheart," said Forsyth, coming closer to her side, "I can bear anything but that. Your tears make me weak, your grief unmans me." She hid her face in her hands and struggled hard for self-control. Then he went round to the other side of the horse. "Look at the lake, dear," he said. "Or look at me and forget what lies beyond." So they marched, in the full glare of the afternoon sun. The pitiless heat burned into the sand and was thrown back into their faces, but Beatrice did not once turn her head to the left, and Robert, looking past her, was thankful that she didn't. Chardonnay and his mother were side by side, locked in each other's arms. Their bodies had not been touched, but others near them had been stripped and mutilated beyond all recognition. When they came to the bank of the river, they looked anxiously towards the fort and the trading station, but saw only Indians. A young warrior met Black Partridge there, and Beatrice was told to dismount. She did so, thinking that in a few minutes more she would be at home again. But when she saw that they were not going up the river, she could not keep back a cry of pain. The chief turned upon her fiercely and muttered angrily to Robert. "Hush, dear," he said to Beatrice, but his face was very pale. They stood there for some time, and at length a large canoe was brought downstream. "Oh, where are we going?" she moaned. "I don't know, dearest," answered Robert in a low tone, "but wherever it is, we're going together." His fingers tightened upon his sword that still hung at his side. They got into the canoe, Beatrice at the bow and Robert at the stern. Black Partridge took the paddle, and with swift, sure strokes they shot out into the lake and then turned north. After some time Robert ventured to ask a question, but received no answer except a meaningless grunt. The last light lay upon the water and touched it to exceeding beauty. The lake seemed like a great turquoise, deepening slowly to sapphire. Sunset colours flamed upon the clouds near the horizon, but their hearts were heavy, and they didn't see. As twilight approached, the canoe moved even more swiftly, and Black Partridge never faltered at his task. Robert began to wonder if they were going to Fort Mackinac, and laughed at himself for the thought. Now and then, after a sudden spurt ahead, the Indian anxiously scanned the shore, as if he were looking for a landmark. At last they turned in. With a grating of the keel, the canoe grounded on the beach, and they got out. Still wondering, still afraid, and completely at the Indian's mercy. He signed to them to follow him, and they went up the steep bank as best they could, catching at saplings and undergrowth to keep their footing sure. Once on the bluff, they turned northward again, and Beatrice, utterly weary and hopeless, leaned heavily upon Robert's arm. Some way the ground was familiar to him, but he could not have told where they were. It was almost dusk when Black Partridge stopped and waited for them. They followed him down a little incline which was smooth and well worn. "Why?" said Beatrice in astonishment. They were at the door of the little house in the woods that they had discovered so long ago, and over the doorway the silver cross still hung, its gleam hidden in the darkness. The Indian spoke to Robert, repeating each sentence slowly until he understood. Then Robert shook hands with him, and the Indian plunged down the bluff, ran along the beach to his canoe, and went south. With a soft, rhythmic sound, the splash of the paddle died into a murmur, and then into silence. "What was it?" asked the girl, still afraid. "We are to stay here tonight, and perhaps longer. We're to wait until he comes for us. He says this is Mad Margaret's cabin, and that no one will dare to molest us here. The Great Spirit is already displeased because by an accident she was killed. It is not good to touch her nor anything that belongs to her." "Are we safe?" asked Beatrice, in low, moved tones. "Can it be that we're safe at last?" Robert took her into his arms and kissed her twice. "My sweetheart," he said, "my own brave girl, we're safe at last, and we're together for always. Nothing but death can part us now." End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of The Shadow of Victory. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by crystalarmeta. The Shadow of Victory by Myrtle Reed. The Reprieve. Beatrice looked around the cabin curiously, though its aspect was very little changed from her memory of it. The rude, narrow bed at the farther end was still covered with a blue and white patchwork quilt, which Mrs. Mackenzie had so strangely lost. The furniture, as before, consisted of rough chairs and tables made from boxes and barrels by an inexperienced hand. New shelves had been added, and these were filled with provisions in the familiar guise of the trading station. A bolt of calico, some warm winter clothing, and countless articles of necessity and comfort were all neatly put away. Chardonnay had evidently pilfered from his employer constantly and systematically. Whatever he saw that seemed desirable for his mother's use, he had plainly taken at the first opportunity. Even the children's playthings had been brought there to amuse Mad Margaret. Beatrice put aside a cotton curtain that had been fastened across one corner, and was not a little surprised to find her own pink calico gown, which she had made early in the summer. Robert was as interested as she was, though the light was rapidly failing. He had found a tallow dip and kept it within easy reach, though he had his doubts as to the wisdom of a light. With an exclamation of astonishment, he stooped and picked up a pair of moccasins, small, dainty, and heavily beaded, the very pair he had lost. "See, dearest," he said, "these are the moccasins I had for your birthday. I told you they had been stolen. Don't you remember?" The girl turned her sweet face to his. "I'm going to thank you for them now." "I don't deserve it, sweetheart, and I'll tell you why. I wanted to tell you then, but some way I didn't have the courage. I didn't know it was your birthday. I'd had the moccasins a long time, but I didn't want George to get the better of me, and so I let you think I knew." The mention of Ronald's name brought tears to her eyes. "I have a confession to make," she said. "Come here." She put her arm around his neck and drew his head down, then whispered to him. "My darling," he replied brokenly, "did you think me beast enough to grudge him that? I'm glad you did it, and I always will be. Poor lad, he couldn't have you, and you are mine for always." "I know," she sighed, "but I like to think that I made him happy, that he was happy when he died. He loved you, Bee, almost as much as I do." "He couldn't," she said softly, "for nobody ever loved anybody else as much as you love me, and he was quite willing to have it so." Shortly afterward, he came to an active realization of the fact that neither of them had eaten anything since morning. He lighted the tallow dip and searched the cabin until he found a generous supply of the plain fare to which they were accustomed. He wanted to build a fire and make some tea for Beatrice, but she refused, and asked for water instead. He went down the bluff and brought her some, but it was so warm as to be almost insipid. After they had eaten, the inevitable reaction came to Beatrice. The high nervous tension of the past week suddenly snapped and left her as helpless as a child. "Oh," she moaned, "the heat is unbearable. Why doesn't it get cool?" She threw herself upon the narrow bed, utterly exhausted. With a clumsy but gentle touch, he took the pins out of her hair and unfastened her shoes. Beatrice suddenly sat up and threw her shoes into the farthest corner of the cabin. Then a small, soft, indistinct bundle was pushed to the floor. Robert laughed and brought the moccasins. "Will you let me put them on?" he asked. Without waiting for an answer, he slipped them on her bare feet, not at all surprised to find that they fitted perfectly. "The little feet," he said tenderly, "the bare, soft, dimpled things." "The moccasins are softer," she answered in a matter-of-fact tone, "and I think I'm going to sleep now." For a long time he sat beside her, holding her hand in his. They talked of the thousand things which had suddenly become important, their first meeting, their individual impressions of it, and of everything that had happened since. With some trepidation, he told her that he was mainly responsible for the poem which accompanied the Indian basket. "It was a very bad poem," she observed. "Yes," answered Robert with a new note of happy laughter in his voice, "it was an unspeakable poem." Then he described the arrangement which he and Ronald had made to lessen the friction, as he said, and she smiled in the midst of her tears. "Poor lad!" she sighed. "Poor lad!" he repeated, and then, after a long silence, "True lover and true friend." The intervals between question and answer lengthened insensibly, and at last Beatrice slept. He stole away from her on tiptoe and went out in front of the cabin, where there was only a narrow ledge upon the bluff. He sat down in the doorway, where he could hear the slightest sound, and deliberately set himself to watch out the night. He was physically exhausted, but his mind was strangely active. For the first time he was in a position to review the events of his stay at Fort Dearborn. From the night of his arrival, when Mad Margaret had appeared at the trading station, to the present hour, when he sat in her pathetic little cabin, with the girl he loved so near him that he could hear her deep breathing as she slept. "What has it done for me?" he thought. "What has it brought me?" The answer was Beatrice, which came with a passionate uplifting of his soul. With a certain boyish idea of knight errantry, he had kept his hands and his heart clean, and in consequence, love brought him at last an exquisite fineness of joy. In that hour of close self-communion, his deepest satisfaction was this: that in all the years, in spite of frequent temptation, there was nothing of which he need to be ashamed, nothing to remember with a pang of bitterness when Beatrice lifted her innocent eyes to his. Sir Galahad, some of his friends had called him, jeeringly, and, before, it had never failed to bring the colour to his face. But now the words rang through his consciousness like a trumpet blast of victory. He was spared that inner knowledge of shame and unworthiness which lies, like bitter lees, in the wine of man's love. Beatrice, Beatrice. Like another of her name, she had led him through hell, and he saw now a certain sweet slavery in prospect. Wherever his thoughts might wander, she would always be with him, like the golden thread which runs through a dull tapestry, in and out of the design, sometimes hidden for an instant, but never lost. Aunt Eleanor and Uncle John, they had been like father and mother to him, and he loved the children as though they were his own. The plaintive lisp of the little girl came back to his memory with remorseful tenderness, and he smiled as he wondered dreamily what Beatrice might have been at 4 or 5. Swiftly upon the thought came another, which set the blood to singing in his veins, and which he put from him quickly, as one retreats from something too beautiful and too delicate to touch. Captain Wells and Dr. Norton, they were dead, and Ronald, a lump came into his throat which he could not keep down, for, of all the men in the world, the blue-eyed soldier was best fitted to be his friend. They supplemented one another perfectly, each having what the other lacked, and enough in common to make firm, neutral ground whereupon friendship might safely stand. Of his other friends at the Fort he thought idly, since he had not known them so well, but he was genuinely glad that they had survived the horrors of the day. As night wore on, the battle assumed indistinct and indefinite phases. Here and there, some incident stood out vividly, unrelated and detached. He had spoken truly when he told Beatrice that a mere handful had been lost. What, indeed, did such things matter in the face of history? It was but the price of a new country, which courageous souls had been paying for 2 centuries and more, and which some must continue to pay until, like a flash of lightning, came sudden breadth of view. What if 1,000 had died instead of 50? How could it change the meaning? Broad and beautiful, from the Atlantic to the unknown shore, measured leagues away, stretched a new country. Vast beyond the dreams of empire, which belonged to his race for the asking. Something stirred in his pulses, uncertain but vital, so strangely elemental that it seemed one with the reaches of water that lay just beyond him. Here at the head of Lake Michigan, some day there must be what? There was a rustle beside him, but it was only a leaf. In the stillness it seemed as if it must wake Beatrice. Another near it fluttered idly, and a white birch trembled. A sudden coolness came into the air, and then out of the lake rose the blessed northeast wind with life and healing upon its gray wings. He went into the cabin to put a blanket over Beatrice. Her face was turned toward the door, that her wounded arm might be uppermost, and something in her attitude of childish helplessness brought the mist to his eyes. The white, soft arm with the bandage upon it had its own irresistible appeal. Half fearing to wake her, he stooped to kiss it softly, thrilled with a tenderness so great that his love was almost pain. He went back to the cabin door, where the wind was rioting amid the saplings, and sat down again. Already there was a hushed murmur upon the shore, and when the late moon rose, full and golden, from the mysterious vault beyond the horizon, the lake was white with tossing plumes, the manes of the plunging steeds that led the legions of the sea. Far out upon the water was a path of beaten gold, that fairy path which the little Beatrice had thought to take when she went to visit the moon people. The memory of that night came back with rapturous pain, when he had found the words to tell her what she was and what she meant to him, as far as words could express the sacred emotion that was kindled upon the altars of his inmost soul. The moonlight shone into the cabin, and full upon the girl's face, the childish sweetness, the womanly softness of her as she lay there came to him like the breath of a rose. A thread of light went higher and touched the silver cross to lambent flame. Beyond it, over the cabin, was... He sprang to his feet and ran up the little incline to the bluff. In spite of the thick woods, he could see the ominous glare upon the clouds in the southwest, and knew only too well what it portended. "Cowards! Dogs!" he muttered. "They are burning the fort!" His hands shut and opened nervously, and the nails cut deep into the flesh. A savage impulse to wrest every foot of soil from the Indians shook him from head to foot. Here at the head of Lake Michigan, then the dream came upon him with the claim of mastery, the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers and gorgeous palaces. His thought swiftly framed the words. Then he laughed shortly and turned away. But all at once he knew what he must do. He saw himself clearly in the van of that humble army, which has no trappings of soldiery or state, but only the weapons of peace, by which, from the beginning, all men have ultimately conquered. The plow and the harrow, the spade and the pruning knife, the steady toil with hand and brain, here and now. Step by step he saw the savages forced backward, their arrows met with muskets and the ring of steel, back to the farthest limits of the civilization which at last should sweep them from the face of the earth. It was the dominant race beating back the opposition, the conquest of the wilderness by those fitted to rule. Fired with purpose and ambition, He stood there until the lurid light in the southwest began to fade. Not one life, but the many. Not the reaping, but the planting. He did not know it, but strong upon him had come the spirit of the pioneer. The moon rose high in the heavens, and from the zenith sent stray lines of light to touch the cross, where the figure of the Christ, wondrously molded, was eloquent with voiceless appeal. The stars faded as if blown out by the wind, and then there was a soft voice at his side. "Have I been asleep, dear?" "You sweet girl," he laughed, taking her into his arms. "You've slept all night. It's nearly time for sunrise now." "I didn't know. You'll go to sleep now, won't you?" "No, dearest, I'm not sleepy." "Neither am I, so I'm going to stay with you." In the doorway of the cabin, they sat while the darkness waned. The wind lifted her magnificent hair in long, slender strands, and now and then, when a heavy tress touched his face caressingly, Beatrice laughed and pulled it away. "Don't," he said. "You dear silly boy, you don't want my hair in your face." "Yes, I do." "Why?" "Because I love you, from the crown of your head to your dimpled foot, with all the strength of my soul." There was a long silence, then the girl sighed contentedly. "I never thought love was anything like this, did you?" "No, dear, I didn't know what it was." "I didn't either, but of course I wondered. From all I had heard and read, I was afraid of it, and I thought it would make me unhappy, but it doesn't. I can't tell you how it makes me feel. It seems as if God made us for each other in the beginning, but kept us apart, and even after we met it wasn't much better until all at once there was a light, and then we knew. It seems as if I never could be miserable, or out of sorts again, as if everything was right and always will be, that whatever came to me, you'd help me bear it, and always you'd be my shield." "Sweetheart," he answered, deeply touched, "I trust I may be. It would be my greatest happiness to bear your pain for you." Far in the east there was a faint colour upon the clouds. "See," she said, "it is day." He drew her closer, and she went on. "Think what it means to go away forever from all this horror, to go back to the hills." Robert swallowed hard, then said thickly, "Heart of mine, I would die to shield you, but destiny calls us here." With a cry, the girl started to her feet. "Here!" she gasped. "Robert, what do you mean?" In an instant he was beside her, with her cold hand in his. "What do you mean?" she cried. "Listen, dear. I am asking nothing of you. It is for you to say. Tomorrow we will be taken to Detroit as British prisoners. For how long we do not know. The Indians have burned the fort, but some day, when the war is over, we must come here to live. For to go back is to acknowledge defeat." The word stung her pride. "Defeat," she said, "and why? Why are we defeated if we choose to live in a safe place instead of in a danger, in peace rather than in the fear of massacre? Yesterday, did you not see? Only by the merest chance I am not among them, and yet you ask me to go back?" Her voice vibrated with feeling, and her breast heaved. Even in the dim, purple light of early morning, he could see the suffering in her face, and it struck him like a blow. "My darling, listen. Let me tell you what I mean. We will go wherever you say. If it pleases you to live in France or England, we will go there. It is for you to decide, not for me. Do you understand?" "Yes," she answered dully. "Go on." Robert's dream was dim, and the fire of his ambition had dwindled, but he went on bravely. "We are at the very edge of civilization, dear, and it must go on beyond us. The tide is moving westward, and we must either go with it or against it. We must go forward or retreat. There is no standing still. Yesterday a battle was fought, which, in its essence, was for the possession of the frontier. We have surrendered, but we have not given up. If we retreat, it must be fought again. From shore to shore of this great country, there must be one flag and one law. Here where the ashes of the fort now lie, some day a city must stand." "So," said the girl with a harsh laugh, "and you would build a city from dreams." The tone hurt him to the quick. "Yes," he answered steadfastly, "I would. Nothing in the world was ever built without a dream at the beginning." "Well," she said after a silence, "what then?" "Sweetheart," he cried, "you make it hard." Upon the purple light in the east came gold and crimson, touched here and there with a deep sapphire blue. Little by little, a glorious fabric was woven upon the vast looms of dawn. Beatrice saw his face, strained and anxious, and knew in her heart that she would yield. What Katherine had said came back to her. When you find your mate, you have to go. There is no other way. "Tomorrow we go," he was saying, "back to the hills, but that is not the end. It is only the reprieve. We must come back here to fight it out, to finish the task we have begun, to hold our place in the face of all odds. We must stand in the front rank of civilization, make our footing steady and sure, carry the flag westward into the stronghold of the wilderness, make a city, if you will, from dreams. Beatrice, this is the last time. I shall never ask you again. We will do as you will. This is my only plea. I ask you now, with the horrors of yesterday still alive in your heart, with your wound still open and sore, to come back here with me, where the fort is rebuilt, and fight it out by my side. It must be done by others, if not by us. And if we retreat, we are shamed. God knows I love you, or I would not ask you this. God knows I would shield you, and yet I would not have shamed you. Wherever there is human life, there is also danger. But we must make a place where our children and our children's children may live without fear. Heart of mine, so strong and brave, you are not the one to falter. My life, my queen." He cried in a voice that rang, "Are you not a mate for a man?" Prismatic colors lay on the water, and the sunrise stained her face. Far across the pearly reaches, a new day was dawning, and she looked at him steadily, as if her eyes would search his inmost soul. Once more he said huskily, "Will you come and do your part? Will you fight it out with me?" Love and pain were in his voice. His body was tense and eager, like one who pleads for his utmost joy. Beatrice felt his courage, his passionate uplifting, and it stirred her pulses sharply, like a bugle call, caught on that wave of absolute surrender, seeking only for the ultimate good. The girl's soul rose superbly to meet his own. The first ray of sun leaped across the water to touch her face with transfiguring light, and there was a gleam from the cross above her, where the splendor of the morning was turned back toward the altars from whence it came. Her fear fell from her like a garment. The horrors of the past were forgotten, and she saw herself one with him, on whatever height he may choose to stand. Her burnished hair was like an aureole about her, and in her eyes was the fire of victory. Mate for a man she was in that exalted moment, when she leaned toward him with her lips parted, and her soul aflame, and high resolve, the eastern heavens illumined with a flood of white light that seemed like a challenge. "Once more, sweetheart, will you come?" She smiled, and her sweet lips trembled, as if already she felt his kiss. Then, clear and strong as the note of a silver trumpet, came the girl's triumphant answer. "Yes," she cried, "I will." The end. End of Chapter 24. Recording by crystalarmeta. End of The Shadow of Victory by Myrtle Reed.